Welcome to everybody today. We have a very exciting podcast planned. We have Katie Biddlestone with us, who is the National Women's Officer and Industrial Officer with the SDA, who is the employee union in our industry. And we're very excited to have Katie with us because she has some wonderful expertise, particularly around managing domestic violence in the workplace and working with employees that are experiencing domestic violence or alternatively are perpetrators. So welcome, Katie. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Dominique. And thank you very much for having me here today.
Oh, it's our pleasure. What makes you so passionate about what you do, particularly in your role as, National Women's Officer?
I think the most important thing for me is it gives me an opportunity to make sure that we're supporting employees at really critical times throughout their employment. And one of the most critical times that people face is if they are experiencing family and domestic violence. So we try to make sure that when we're advocating with employers that we're making sure that the best processes and policies are put in place to recognise and respond to domestic violence if it's happening. And we also have taken steps to make sure that our officials and organisers who are out dealing with members day in, day out are also trained appropriately so that they can respond to members if they disclose, because in the work that we do, the union is often the person that someone will disclose to if they're experiencing family and domestic violence, particularly if we've gone into a workplace to represent somebody in relation to a performance management issue or counselling or warning because of performance, which is occurring because of domestic violence.
That's really good to know, because I think for many of our listeners, they're often, if they become aware of an issue like this, they often don't know where to turn. But knowing that your industrial officers are all trained is really important. Can you tell me a bit about that training, just for other small businesses that might be listening, that might be looking to implement something similar?
Yeah, of course. The way that we approached it is that we've developed some guidance material for our organisers who go out on a day-to-day basis and have contact with our members. We've also provided some informal training to those people about how they should be responding to members and how they can assist them on the workplace issues. It's very difficult in our job to create boundaries about what we can and can't do for people. So we try and contain it to how we can represent them in the workplace. The other thing that we've also done, and this is a twofold response, it's so that we can adequately respond to our employees if they're experiencing domestic violence, but also so that we can respond to our members if they come to us, is that we've actually trained, nominated contact people in every branch and the national office on how to recognise and respond to family and domestic violence, so that we know that we're adequately trained to respond appropriately to those people. And it's really important those people act as an expert in each branch so that organisers can go to them if they have any questions or need assistance. Sometimes those contact people will actually take over looking after that member in that circumstance.
Well, that's great to know. So, certainly for any businesses that are listening, obviously it's important to have contact people if you can have them. So you don't have to train necessarily all of your staff in great detail, but just making sure that somebody has those skills or a higher level of skills to manage a situation can also be useful, when dealing with domestic and family violence. Katie, in your experience, typically when an employee comes to you, what are some of the workplace issues that they often report?
Most of the issues that occur as a result of family and domestic violence are things that impact on performance at work, things like turning up to work late, not being able to attend at all in some circumstances due to whether it be an injury or other form of violence that's occurring, impacts on performance. So if you can imagine if domestic violence is occurring in your home, you might be having lack of sleep, there might be ongoing fatigue, and all of those things can impact on your ability to do your job. I think it's really important too that we understand that domestic violence isn't always a visible thing. It's not always physical. So when you are looking at recognising signs of domestic violence, it's not just someone turning up to work with a physical sign of the violence. We've had members who, when they're being performance managed about being late or not attending work, it's been because of things like having their car blocked in their driveway and then having to walk 40 minutes to work because their partner won't move the car or provide the keys. Not being able to attend work because their partner was supposed to come home and look after the children and deliberately didn't come home. So that prevented that person from attending work. We've had really severe examples of financial abuse, which again are not visible to an employer. In one case, a member attending work who was being withheld money and access to be able to bring food to work. So she was working 8-9 hour shifts with no food to have during that shift. And all of those things impact on someone's ability to work, but aren't necessarily visible signs of things that might be happening.
I mean, there's such concerning stories. And, as we know, from the statistics that 1 in 6 women, still experience domestic and family violence in the workplace. In your experience, have you had members where perpetrators have incessantly been calling or ringing the employer in a situation and making up stories about that employee in an effort to get them terminated?
We have had examples where perpetrators are calling the workplace, things like that. But in the retail context, the other thing that often happens is they enter the workplace physically. So that's always a risk factor in terms of that employee's safety. And sometimes it's not overt actions. It can be just their presence at work that creates anxiety and distress for that person and again impacts on their performance. We also, when it's more serious and there's potential risk to, physical violence, not only to the employee concerned, but maybe others in the workplace, we've had to work with companies to implement some pretty strict safety protocols around how that perpetrator might be managed if they do enter the workplace. So it can have some, sort of far-reaching impacts if it does continue to happen in the workplace.
And I guess for our listeners, I mean, it's important to know that you can work, obviously, with the SDA to obtain resources to ensure the protection of those workers and to work through those difficulties. Can you tell me a little bit about, what work you've done, to educate members just simply about domestic violence and the impacts and what their rights are in the workplace?
We've developed some material for our members. So we have posters that can be put up in workplaces. We've also developed a pocket card which can be put in staff rooms, and that has referral services and also information about how domestic violence can impact you at work. Just as a reminder and to make people aware that it's not just something that happens in the home, it can impact every aspect of your life. And in the workplace, you can get support for that so that you can continue to work. And we know that one of the key things for people experiencing domestic violence is maintaining their employment and their financial security and independence. So to support an employer to do that is really, really important.
Really good tips. I mean, do you find that businesses who fail to recognise the connection between domestic and family violence in the workplace find themselves in more difficult situations?
I think the experience that we've had is that the difficulties arise if employers aren't prepared. So the employers that we deal with who have still not implemented a policy and procedures around dealing with domestic violence, they're the employers we find don't know how to respond appropriately, and where they could have dealt with something in the early stages quite well and effectively, it's become a much bigger problem to deal with by the time they get around to doing that, because they simply, without policy and procedures and appropriate training for managers or people who are going to have to respond to a disclosure, there's no guidance for those people on how to effectively and appropriately respond. So it's important that not only for the person who is disclosing that they're experiencing domestic violence, but for the person in the workplace who receives that disclosure, for them to be appropriately prepared is really important.
I mean, a big thing that we certainly see is, I guess, a lack of understanding around privacy as well. So, ensuring that obviously you can protect that person's privacy while still educating, some of the workers that are around them to make sure that they remain safe. I mean, how's something like that managed, well? I mean, what have you seen work well in that scenario?
Look, I think the best way that works is that you can still, as a manager, have conversations with employees that talk about, having to implement measures and controls and different things for an employee without disclosing the reasons for that. But it is important that if you are implementing measures, if working hours or things like that are changing, it is good to make people aware that, look, these things are happening. There are reasons for it, and we just need to support that employee without, breaching any confidentiality that you might need to retain.
I mean, one of the more controversial, things that we're seeing obviously emerge out of domestic violence in the workplace is certainly how you deal with perpetrators. For us, many of our membership, certainly employers, their first reaction to having a disclosure about having to attend court, for a domestic and family violence matter is potentially to terminate that person. And of course, that's not always in the best interests of either, the person experiencing domestic and family violence or for the perpetrator. In your experience, how have you seen perpetrators present themselves in the workplace?
Look, we haven't dealt with many perpetrators in terms of them coming to the union for assistance, and I think there's probably a variety of reasons for that. But I think it is a difficult issue to manage, and I understand that for many employers it would be difficult. I think it's important that companies have clear policies on violence broadly, and that engaging in violence within and outside of the workplace won't be tolerated. And that includes things like sexual harassment. It's also important that those messages are included in any education and training that's conducted in the workplace. And I think having those open, visible statements and policy and training can really assist in developing good workplace cultures that aim to prevent violence and harassment more broadly, not only in the workplace, but also within the community and at home. I do think, though, if you do have that kind of policy in place, you can approach it in a couple of ways. It does maybe give avenues for disciplinary action or termination. But equally, I think if the decision is made to retain that person's employment, then there should be some support mechanisms in place for that person, offer of training and education and time off to do that if possible, so that we can look at implementing measures that will actually aim to prevent the violence from continuing. I think the other important thing as well to assess is whether the victim and the perpetrator are within the same workplace. And that raises a whole nother set of complexities, because then you then have to think about how you comply with your obligations under work health and safety, and also how you might have to comply with conditions that are set out in intervention orders. That again raises a whole nother set of issues that an employer will have to work through to make sure they're providing a safe workplace.
So, Katie, we know with intervention orders that, some of the time that it won't be in relation to simply a partnership between a couple, but it also can involve children. And given that, as an industry, we employ the most young people in the country, I think this is something that is really important to understand. Have you had instances where intervention orders have been raised in a workplace level against a parent, for instance?
We have, and this is a significant issue, and I think it doesn't have a lot of oversight within family and domestic violence, because we tend to have a perception that when there is family and domestic violence, it's between partners. But we have had examples of our young members contact us because of violence by a parent, and there will be an intervention order in place, and they'll be living with the other parent, but that parent continues to enter the workplace. And so we've had to work with employers on measures to try and support that young worker through that experience of family and domestic violence and provide a safe workplace for that person. So it's important when we're developing policies and we're looking at education and training that it does cover all of the different iterations of the relationships that family and domestic violence can occur in.
I think that's really important because, for many of our young workers, they've got to notify, they have to list a guardian, for instance, or a contact person. And I think it's really important, I guess, for our employers to understand that, not all relationships with parents are healthy or remain healthy for the period that individual works for the business. So I think that's a really good tip, certainly for our listeners, that obviously domestic and family violence, can be between, different parts of a family, whether it be parent and child or, two partners or, any other iteration that may occur. And look, and we've certainly seen it in our membership. We have had members that have had intervention orders within the same workplace and have had to manage, distances. And I think that there is a misconception that an intervention order will solely be you can't come within 500 metres of me, but that's not always the case. There's a whole raft of other
that's
requirements.
correct.
And so I think in those situations, of course, it's really important to obtain copies of those intervention orders, particularly for safety purposes, and to manage that, as much as you can.
That's right. And consulting with the person concerned about what the measures will look like so that they are complying with the order and what's going to be comfortable for that person in terms of the measures that are put in place as well, so that both employees have an opportunity to have continued employment if that can be achieved.
I think it's really difficult because obviously it really brings everything into the workplace, and once something like an intervention order is put into safety protocols within a workplace, of course breaches of that safety protocol become issues of misconduct or issues of performance and then also require being managed. So it certainly adds another level of complexity there, for both, individuals involved, because we do know that obviously typically it would take someone 7 attempts to leave their partner if they are experiencing domestic and family violence. It's not something that just simply happens. So to have it in the workplace, you may have an intervention order and the partnership may decide to try and have that intervention order, ended so that they can try and fix whatever's happening in their relationship. So, it can be a very long journey, I think, for employers and certainly difficult for other employees around them. What impacts have you seen on fellow staff members around situations like this, or, people who have worked with individuals experiencing domestic family violence or perpetrators?
To be honest, it's a really mixed response. And I think, like we see anyone, whether it's a manager or a colleague, we do get mixed responses when people disclose that they're experiencing family and domestic violence. Some people are very supportive. Others do become fearful sometimes, particularly if there's any risk of the violence entering the workplace. Others simply don't know how to provide support. So I think that's where the workplace is preparing for responding to family and domestic violence, providing training and education to all employees about family and domestic violence is really important, so that if it does happen, everyone in the workplace understands how domestic violence can impact work and how they can respond and provide support if someone in the workplace is experiencing it.
And look, if any of our listeners are interested in obviously obtaining some of the resources that you've talked about, or to talk further about, how they might implement some strategies in their workplace, whether it be pocket cards or the like, who are they best to contact?
More than happy for anyone to contact me directly at the National Office in the SDA.
Look, thank you so much for your time today. It's been very interesting and educational. Certainly from our side, of course, we deal with the employers, but hearing about some of those experiences from employees on the ground, I don't think that any employer would ever, want to stand by or be a bystander with something like that happening, to someone that they work with day in and day out. And we know that workplaces play such a pivotal role, in this space. So, any information that you can provide is I think, always going to go a really long way.
That's great. And I really would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to your members today, and also want to congratulate the NRA and yourself on the leadership that your organisation has taken on this issue. It isn't an easy one, but it's a very important one. And I think that you're right, workplaces can play a key role in this if we're prepared to do that. So, and the Hub provides some excellent resources for employers so that they can have the right tools to make sure they're supporting their employees. So I really congratulate you on that.
Well, thank you. And look, so if any of our listeners are, need advice or, are looking for more information about the Hub or anything like that, you can always call 1-800-RETAIL.
Thanks for listening. The Domestic Violence Retailer Support Hub is a project of the National Retail Association in conjunction with the Queensland Government. Catch up and contribute at www.dvretail.com.au.